Flat Stanley and the Haunted House, created by Jeff Brown, written by Laurie Haskins Horan, pictures by Mackie Pemituan. Stanley Lambchop lived with his mother, his father, and his little brother Arthur. Stanley was 4 feet tall, about a foot wide, and half an inch thick. He had been flat ever since a bulletin board fell on him. Mostly, Stanley liked being flat. He was very good at dodgeball and hide and seek. "Will there be limbo at our party?" asked Stanley. He was very good at limbo, too. "Yes," said Mrs. Lambchop. Stanley's school was having a Halloween party. "I want to see the haunted house," said Arthur. "I hope it's really scary." "Not too scary," said his mother. "There will be small children at the party." Mrs. Lambchop zipped up Arthur's monster costume. She had sewn it herself. "Perfect," she said. "Scary, but not too scary." Stanley put on his costume too. He was a blueberry pancake. "You look good enough to eat," Mrs. Lambchop said. "Let's go." Arthur and Mrs. Lambchop got in the car. Mr. Lambchop tied Stanley to the roof rack. "All set, Stanley?" he asked. "All set," Stanley answered. The school gym was full of pirates and witches and fairies. "Hey, look," Arthur said. "Hay is for horses, Arthur," Mrs. Lambchop told him. "I know," said Arthur. "Look." A horse trotted by. "Oh," said Mrs. Lambchop. "Sorry, dear." "There's the haunted house," Arthur said to Stanley. They stood in line behind the horse. "What a clever costume." The horse's mother said to Stanley, "You look as flat as a pancake." At last their turn came. "Come on," said Stanley. The boys stepped inside. "Boo!" yelled a ghost. Arthur said the ghost's sneakers looked like Coach Bart's. A werewolf howled. Then it sneezed. "Bless you," said the ghost politely to the werewolf. "This isn't scary at all," Stanley said. "Let's get out of here, Arthur." Outside, Arthur and Stanley saw a little boy crying. It was their neighbor, Martin Tibbs. "What's wrong?" asked Stanley. "Did the haunted house scare you?" "No," Martin sniffled. "Martin told them that a bully had stolen his giant candy corn. It was my prize for winning the limbo contest," he said sadly. "I missed the limbo contest? Rats," said Stanley. "Where did the mean kid go?" asked Arthur. Martin pointed across the gym. An older boy leaned against the wall. Next to him was the candy corn. "That's one big candy corn," said Arthur. "That's one big kid," said Stanley. Stanley looked at Arthur's costume. "I have an idea," he said. "Make room for me, Arthur." Stanley took off his costume and slipped inside Arthur's. Then he whispered in Arthur's ear. "Great plan," Arthur said. "Just don't blink." Arthur walked over to the big kid. Stanley didn't blink. "Give that candy corn back, or else," Arthur demanded. "Or else what?" said the bully. "I'll tell everyone that you're scared of me," said Arthur. The kid stood up tall. He stepped right up in front of Arthur and Stanley. Stanley still didn't blink. "Why should I be scared of you?" the bully growled. "I'm a two-headed monster," Arthur said. The boy pointed to Stanley's face. "Ha, that head is so fake," he said. Then Stanley blinked. "Fake?" said Stanley. "Oh, really?" "Ah!" yelled the bully. He ran out of the gym door, leaving the candy corn behind. "Yes!" yelled Stanley and Arthur. They jumped up and down inside Arthur's costume. Martin picked up his candy corn. "Thanks, guys." "Uh-oh," said Arthur. Stanley turned around. Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop were standing behind them. "Arthur and Stanley Lambchop, I saw what you did," Mrs. Lambchop said sternly. That was scary. Then Mrs. Lamb Chop smiled. Too scary.